In October 2019, an oil surveyor dug through the deep sands of western Tunisia. The brutal midday sun baked the dunes as the wind howled, whipping coarse sand against the surveyor's protective goggles. He was dragging a heavy ground-penetrating radar sled across a desolate stretch of the Kasserine Pass when the machine suddenly shrieked. He stopped dead in his tracks. Buried exactly 4 meters beneath the shifting dunes was a massive, jagged, metallic anomaly. When he brushed away the top layer of earth, a rusted iron cross emerged from the dirt, painted on the torn fuselage of a World War II aircraft. But it was the terrifying condition of the metal that prompted him to immediately contact the authorities. When an international team of aviation archaeologists and military historians finally arrives weeks later, they uncover a sprawling, catastrophic debris field stretching for nearly 300 meters. Inside the crushed cockpit lies an astonishingly preserved leather flight log. Dated November 1942, alongside a deeply unsettling mystery object, an American .50 caliber bullet casing, heavily deformed, wedged directly into the armored plating of the pilot's seat. This singular piece of brass suggests an impossible implication, that this elite fighter plane was not shot down in a glamorous dogfight by an Allied Spitfire, but was violently swatted from the sky by something much closer to the ground. Hauptmann Dieter Kessler was a seasoned Luftwaffe flight commander who had survived the harrowing aerial battles over London. According to official German military records from 1943, he perished in a tragic, unavoidable mechanical accident due to severe engine failure in the harsh desert environment. But the pulverized fuselage and that single piece of American brass tell a profoundly different, much darker story. The aircraft was systematically shredded, ripped apart by a weapon of devastating kinetic power. How did a highly maneuverable Messerschmitt Bf 109 fall? Victim to a ground-based bullet, what truly happened in the skies over North Africa that the German High Command was so desperate to hide? If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. Hauptmann Dieter Kessler was 28 years old, a pragmatic and analytical man whose quiet demeanor sharply contrasted with the flamboyant arrogance often associated with fighter aces. Raised in the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, Kessler possessed a deeply mechanical mind. He understood the limits of metal, fuel, and human endurance. By late 1942, his reputation within the Luftwaffe was sterling. He was known not for reckless bravery, but for icy calculation and bringing his men back alive. He was an ordinary man thrust into an extraordinary position of leadership, a professional soldier who viewed war as a deadly equation of physics and logistics rather than a glorious crusade. The historical situation in North Africa during the autumn of 1942 was rapidly spiraling into a logistical nightmare. General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was stretched to the breaking point, desperately relying on fragile, overextended supply lines across the Mediterranean. However, the Luftwaffe held a distinct advantage in the air. For months, German pilots had perfected the art of the convoy strafing run. The British forces they faced utilized lightly armed vehicles, often defending their supply columns with small-caliber Bren guns. For Kessler and his squadron, dropping from the sky at 400 miles per hour to incinerate British trucks was a routine, almost mundane exercise. The British doctrine dictated evasion. When attacked, their convoys would scatter into the desert, leaving themselves vulnerable to repeated, leisurely passes by the predatory German fighters. Then came November 1942, and the massive Allied amphibious invasion known as Operation Torch landed thousands of fresh American forces onto the shores of North Africa. But the sudden shift in the war's momentum was not immediately apparent to the confident German pilots. Initially, Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed the Americans as green, untested, and poorly disciplined. Yet, strange anomalies began to ripple through the daily combat reports. Veteran pilots, men who had survived years of intense combat over the English Channel and the frozen steppes of Russia, were suddenly vanishing on what were supposed to be routine milk runs over American supply routes. Within the span of just 3 weeks, 12 aircraft from Kessler's immediate wing simply failed to return. There were no reports of massive Allied fighter sweeps in the sectors where they disappeared, nor were there significant concentrations of heavy anti-aircraft artillery. The planes were simply gone, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving desert. High command in Berlin grew increasingly agitated. Hermann Göring personally demanded a discreet but urgent investigation into the alarming attrition rate, issuing strict, secret orders. To Kessler's commanding officers, find the cause of the losses, but do not let the true numbers leak to the rank and file. Panic was a contagion the Axis forces could not afford. What they didn't know was that the answer lay not in the sky, but mounted on the back of every American truck. On the crisp, cloudless morning of November 24, 1942, Kessler's flight of 4 Messerschmitts departed their dusty airstrip near Tunis. Their official destination was a routine reconnaissance patrol along the coast, but Kessler carried a set of secret coordinates scribbled hastily on a torn map. He was leading his men deep into the contested zone near Kasserine, hunting for an American supply convoy that intelligence had spotted moving east. The air was frigid at 10,000 feet, the roar of the Daimler-Benz engines a comforting, rhythmic drone against the vast silence of the desert sky. For the first 45 minutes, the flight was entirely uneventful. However, the sheer scale of the desert presented its own formidable obstacles. Navigation over the featureless dunes required intense concentration, and the blinding glare of the African sun reflected off the sand, creating disorienting mirages. As they crossed into enemy territory, the fuel gauges in their fighters dropped to 60%. Kessler knew they had precisely 20 minutes of loiter time before they had to turn back. Then he spotted them, a long, snaking line of olive-drab American trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps kicking up a massive plume of dust on the valley floor below. Kessler signaled his wingmen. They would execute a classic textbook strafing run, drop out of the sun, hit the leading vehicles to halt the column, and then tear through the immobilized trucks. As he pushed his stick forward, the Messerschmitt plunged into a steep, screaming dive. The speedometer needle rapidly climbed past 400 kilometers per hour. At 1,500 meters, Kessler confidently expected the convoy to scatter in panic, just as the British always did, but the American trucks didn't stop. They didn't scatter, they held their formation. At 1,000 meters, the critical turning point arrived, transforming the battle into an incomprehensible nightmare. The convoy erupted in a terrifying, synchronized wall of fire. This was not the sporadic, light rattle of infantry machine guns. It was a deafening, thunderous roar, a shitstorm of heavy tracer rounds reaching up like solid fingers of fire. Every single American vehicle was mounted with a weapon designed in 1918 to puncture early tanks, the .50 caliber M2 Browning. Firing heavy slugs capable of penetrating armor at a staggering range of 6,000 meters, the truck drivers had essentially turned their supply column into a mobile, lethal anti-aircraft battery. Kessler's cockpit suddenly smelled of burning cordite and vaporized hydraulic fluid. A deafening metallic crack echoed through his headset as a half-inch solid slug punched clean through his engine. Block instantly severing the fuel lines. Oil sprayed across his canopy, blinding him. The temperature gauge spiked violently. To his right, he watched in horror as his wingman's aircraft simply disintegrated in midair, the fragile wings sheared off by the concentrated barrage of heavy-caliber fire. The hunter had instantly become the prey. With his engine dead and his plane vibrating violently, Kessler fought the sluggish controls, desperately trying to pull out of the dive. He was forced to bring the crippled, smoking fighter down hard into the unforgiving rocky dunes, skidding for 300 terrifying meters before slamming into a dry riverbed. Bruised, bleeding, and surrounded by the wreckage of his shattered command, Kessler crawled from the burning metal. He was 40 miles behind enemy lines, armed only with a small pistol and a single canteen of water. Over the next 3 grueling days, fighting severe dehydration and hiding from heavily armed American patrols under the freezing desert moon, he slowly made his way back to Axis lines. He arrived battered and exhausted, carrying a truth that no one wanted to hear. Almost immediately upon his return to the German base, the atmosphere shifted from relief to intense, suffocating suspicion. Kessler was not sent to the hospital to recover. Instead, he was sequestered in a dimly lit, sweltering command tent where 2 high-ranking Abwehr intelligence officers waited. For 6 grueling hours, they subjected him to relentless interrogations. They demanded to know how an elite flight of 4 fighters had been completely wiped out by a mere supply convoy. When Kessler repeatedly explained the devastating wall of heavy-caliber fire and the sheer number of guns mounted on the American trucks, the officers sneered. They refused to document his claims, accusing him of exaggerating to cover up tactical incompetence. The German High Command was facing a catastrophic reality. From November 1942 to May 1943, the Luftwaffe lost a staggering 2,422 aircraft in the Mediterranean theater, representing over 40% of their entire force structure destroyed in a matter of months. Acknowledging that uneducated American teenagers driving supply trucks were effectively slaughtering the elite pilots of the Reich was an absolute propaganda disaster. Therefore, the official reports were systematically altered. Losses were officially attributed to sudden sandstorms, mechanical fatigue, and overwhelming Allied fighter sweeps. The lethality of the American .50 caliber doctrine was quietly erased from the daily briefings. However, Kessler knew the terrifying truth, and he kept a meticulous, secret secondary logbook detailing every single loss to ground fire. After the Axis surrender in North Africa, Kessler was transferred to the Eastern Front, miraculously surviving the remainder of the war. He returned to a shattered Munich in 1946, slipping seamlessly into the facade of a normal post-war life. He married, had 2 children, and worked for 30 years as a quiet, unassuming civil engineer overseeing municipal water projects. He never spoke of his time in Africa, burying his trauma and his secret journals beneath the mundane routines of suburban existence. Yet decades later, independent military investigators remained deeply suspicious of the Mediterranean casualty figures. During the 1970s, researchers cross-referencing Allied fighter claims with German loss records found glaring, massive discrepancies. Hundreds of German aircraft were marked as destroyed, but no British or American pilot had claimed the kill. When historians requested the original Luftwaffe squadron logs, they frequently found entire pages missing, roughly torn from the binders. The evidence gaps were infuriatingly precise, suggesting a deliberate, systemic purge of the historical record. As the decades slipped away, trails went cold, witnesses passed away, and the mystery faded into obscurity. Kessler died peacefully. In his sleep in 1989, the secret died with him, or so they thought. The breakthrough finally came in late 2021, when a dedicated team of European military archaeologists received permission from the Tunisian government to excavate an anomalous, reinforced concrete structure discovered near the Kasserine Pass. Armed with advanced LiDAR scanners, ground-penetrating radar, and heavy earth-moving equipment, the team spent 3 exhausting weeks clearing away 80 years of accumulated sand and rock. They were searching for a rumored forward operating base used by Luftwaffe intelligence. What they found was a carefully designed, multi-layered bunker complex that had been intentionally sealed from the inside before the German retreat. The first layer of the excavation revealed exactly what the historians expected: a dusty, stifling outer chamber filled with rotting canvas cots, rusted mess tins, and mundane supply manifests. The air was thick with the smell of decayed paper and ancient dust. It appeared to be nothing more than a standard abandoned outpost. However, as the team carefully cataloged the artifacts, an architectural specialist noticed a stark inconsistency in the room's dimensions. The LiDAR scan indicated a hollow void behind the reinforced rear wall. Taking sledgehammers to the crumbling masonry, they breached the second chamber. Inside this hidden radio room lay the first shocking piece of the puzzle. Resting on a heavy wooden desk were the shattered remains of an Enigma machine, and beside it, a series of deeply encrypted daily casualty logs that had escaped the fire. When cryptographic experts finally cracked the ciphers months later, the decoded messages revealed frantic, desperate pleas from local commanders to Berlin. The logs contained a completely separate, highly classified tally of downed aircraft. Next to nearly 300 names was a specific, chilling code phrase: Vernichtet durch schwer Bodenfuhr, destroyed by heavy ground. Fire. But it was the third layer of evidence that began to solidify the terrifying reality. Just outside the bunker's perimeter, the team excavated a massive pit containing the discarded, twisted wreckage of dozens of German aircraft engines and armor plates. Forensic metallurgists and ballistics experts spent weeks meticulously analyzing the damage. The impact craters on the metal were not the jagged, explosive tears characteristic of standard anti-aircraft flak, nor were they the small, neat holes left by British .303 caliber machine guns. They were massive, uniform blunt force punches. The forensic analysis definitively proved that these planes had been repeatedly struck by solid-core, half-inch projectiles traveling at massive supersonic velocities. The planes hadn't been outmaneuvered, they had been brutally bludgeoned out of the sky. But container number 4 held something that changed everything. Deep beneath the radio room, buried in a small, lead-lined vault, the team discovered a pristine, waterproof ammunition tin. Inside lay the personal, handwritten combat report of Hauptmann Dieter Kessler, complete with terrifying hand-drawn diagrams of the American truck convoys. Alongside his diary was a final, suppressed intelligence assessment titled Die Todesfall, The Death Trap. The document explicitly detailed how the American obsession with mounting the heavy M2 Browning on every single vehicle had fundamentally broken German air superiority. The ultimate truth was laid bare. The Luftwaffe wasn't defeated in North Africa by superior Allied fighter planes, but by thousands of ordinary truck drivers laying down an impenetrable wall of lead. The historical significance of this discovery completely reshapes our understanding of the North African campaign and the collapse of the Luftwaffe. For decades, traditional military history has largely attributed the staggering Axis aircraft losses in the Mediterranean to a combination of overstretched supply lines, Allied air superiority, and the harsh desert environment. While those factors certainly played a role, Kessler's hidden cache reveals a massive, deliberate blind spot in the historical narrative. The true butcher of the German Air Force was a weapon designed by John Browning in 1918 to shoot down World War I observation balloons and stop lightly armored vehicles. This revelation starkly highlights the profound difference in military doctrine between the Allied nations. The British military establishment viewed logistics convoys as vulnerable assets to be protected by dedicated escort forces. Their drivers were instructed to flee and seek cover when under aerial assault. However, the American doctrine was brutally, violently pragmatic. The United States military essentially decided that every single moving vehicle in a combat zone was a fighting platform. By bolting the massive, heavy-hitting Deuce to every Jeep, half-track, and supply truck, they transformed soft targets into lethal, aggressive anti-aircraft batteries. The sheer volume of fire a single American convoy could project into the sky was mathematically overwhelming for any attacking aircraft. Furthermore, this discovery serves as a powerful vindication for the dismissed post-war investigators and data analysts who had long argued that the math simply didn't add up. Those researchers, often sidelined by mainstream historians who favored tales of glamorous fighter aces, had correctly deduced that the Luftwaffe was fundamentally bled dry by an unseen force long before the invasion of Fortress Europe. They knew the planes were disappearing, but they lacked the mechanical proof of how it was happening. This explains why German close air support tactics became increasingly timid and ineffective as the war progressed towards Italy and Normandy. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the German pilots was immense. The knowledge that diving on a simple bread truck could result in being ripped apart by .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds shattered their aggressive spirit. While the full extent of this specialized escape network and the deliberate falsification of records by the German High Command is still an ongoing subject of intense investigation, the Kasserine bunker confirms that the cover-up was real, systematic, and incredibly effective. Among the cold, hard military data and forensic evidence found in the bunker, the most profoundly affecting discoveries were the deeply personal objects Kessler had hidden away. Tucked carefully into the back flap of his leather journal was a faded, black-and-white photograph of his original 1941 squadron. There were 12 smiling, confident young men standing proudly in front of a Messerschmitt. With a steady hand, Kessler had drawn a dark, heavy line through the faces of 11 of them. On the back, he had written a single, haunting sentence. The sky didn't take them, the earth reached up and pulled them down. Even more heartbreaking was a draft of a letter, written on official Luftwaffe stationery, but never mailed. It was addressed to the mother of his youngest wingman, a 19-year-old boy who had vaporized in front of Kessler's eyes during that fateful convoy attack. In the draft, Kessler agonized over the lie he was forced to tell her. He wrote of his deep shame in reporting that her son had died in a noble dogfight against overwhelming odds. Rather than admitting, he was blown out of the sky by a kid from Ohio driving a fuel truck. Kessler lived his final years in the quiet suburbs of Munich, haunted by the roar of those engines and the lies he was forced to uphold. When the researchers finally located his surviving grandson in 2022 to present him with the recovered journal, the reaction was one of profound, bittersweet relief. He used to sit in the garden and stare at the sky for hours, the grandson recalled, tracing his fingers over his grandfather's handwriting. He always told me that history is written by the victors, but the truth is usually buried in the dirt. I think he was waiting for someone to finally dig it up. Sometimes, the most decisive shifts in human conflict are not brought about by brilliant generals moving flags on a map, but by the raw, terrifying physics of a half-inch piece of brass. History teaches us that grand narratives often obscure the brutal, mechanical realities of survival. The American obsession with firepower didn't just protect their supply lines. It fundamentally broke the psychology of an elite enemy force, turning the hunters into the hunted and transforming the very air they flew through into a deadly trap. In the end, the truth could not remain buried forever beneath the shifting sands. The howling winds of western Tunisia have a way of eventually uncovering what men desperately try to hide, scraping away the lies to reveal the rusted, bullet-torn reality beneath. The Kasserine bunker has since been sealed, its artifacts moved to museums, but the desert still holds countless unanswered questions. Comment which mystery we should investigate next.